This is Aaron Rice with Maryland Climate Tech 2026. I'm here with a new friend and a very seasoned expert on indoor air quality, Mr. Simon Jones. Simon, tell us who you are, what you do, and where you do it.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. And yeah, likewise, my new friend from over the water. So appreciate you giving me the opportunity to talk. Um, I'm an odd fish. I wear three hats, I suppose, principally. One of them's a little bit duller. I'm a secretary for a couple of organizations, including the International Energy Agency's and Technology Collaboration Program on Energy in Buildings and Communities. That's a big international program that looks at sustainability and energy and air quality and things like that in the built environment. The other hat I wear is I'm a consultant in my day-to-day business. So I advise organizations. There's a little bit about what I'm going to talk about today. And then oddly, I found myself a host of a podcast called Air Quality Matters, which is something I've been doing over the last couple of years and now has become a very big part of my life. I'm very fortunate to speak to amazing people all over the world on this really valuable topic.
Absolutely. So you have a very unique voice style, accent, especially here in the States. We attended a Healthy Buildings Policy Summit in DC in September, hosted by the International Building Institute. Shout out to IWBI. And I was in the room and I heard your voice. I heard you talking to somebody in the back room. I was like, that voice sounds so familiar. I was like, oh, wow, that's Simon. So tell people where you're based.
Yeah, I'm based in Ireland. I've been here for 20 years. I married a good Irish woman many moons ago. And like all good Irish women, they have a homing beacon that eventually brings them back home. So I ended up on this island nearly a good 20 years ago now at this stage. But as you can tell, I'm from England originally,
Yeah.
born and raised around the Oxford area, so the southeast of England.
Hmm.
And I spend my time predominantly at home here with my dog, and the rest of the time traveling, talking to organizations about air quality and ventilation primarily.
Got it. Got it. I've been over the last couple of weeks been really deep diving on some of your content on the podcast. And folks, if you haven't checked out the Air Quality Matters podcast, please do. You can find it on YouTube and other platforms. But your one takes, you did a series of five one takes, and explain what the one take is, and maybe explain maybe the thesis of if you could kind of commingle all five if they had a common message or a common theme. But explain what one takes are and then kind of what you do in that regard.
Yeah, so I have a main podcast, which is a very classic conversational podcast where I get to speak to all sorts of experts all over the world, and they're what we call long forms, so they would last anything up to a couple of hours,
Mhm.
often. But something I was keen to do was to try and highlight work that wasn't necessarily produced by the likes of Harvard or Oxford or UCL, and so many of the papers that we highlight in the air quality community come from big institutions, and there's just so much good output coming out on air quality that about a year ago I started doing what I call the one take podcast, and they're a midweek podcast. It's where I simply take an academic paper or a report and I try to summarize it in one take. So I just sit down, I make some notes, and I sit down a bit like I'm going to do today, just start blathering on about the paper. And this series of five that I've done in the new year was about around the psychology of air quality. So there's some really fascinating kind of sociological, citizen science type papers out talking about why we, both professionals and also consumers, make the decisions we do when it comes to air quality. And I've honestly found them absolutely fascinating. There's been some real, I think you probably agree, some real gold in there, actually, some perspectives that we don't hear enough actually from the air chemists and the physics and the engineers and all of that, that actually there's a the thing that makes the needle move here are the decisions that people make about the environments that they're in, and we need to have those conversations more, I think, actually around with the social scientists, with the citizen scientists, with the people talking to real people in the real world that are making a decision about what fan to buy or whether to turn something on or off.
Open a
Yeah,
window, right?
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
what's interesting is, we have our local utility, shout out to Baltimore Gas and Electric, otherwise known as BGE, here in the Baltimore region. We got a very small grant to be able to do what we call our 30-day healthy home checkup, and we use the Reset accredited, air quality monitors, and basically we're monitoring for two things. We're monitoring for radon and asthma triggers. And we're currently, deployed. We do them in 30-day cohorts, and probably we've done about 2 dozen homes. We've got another, eight or nine that we're actively monitoring. I can pull up my phone and kind of see the PM 2.5 and the radon levels and temperature, humidity, carbon dioxide, VOCs in real time. And so as those numbers should spike, we text immediately to the tenant like, "Hey, are you cooking? What are you doing? Your numbers just spiked. Here's a screenshot of the data." And it's very, very interesting to see how people use their homes. Everyone uses their home a little bit different. I come to this space from discovering radon in my home here in Randallstown, Maryland, at very, very high levels. What the EPA would say, we're smoking 20 to 40 cigarettes a day. It was that high, 15, 20 picocuries per liter. Um, but it's very interesting. We have this misunderstanding here in my market that if you just electrify a building, everything's fine. Right? If you remove the combustion, everything's fine. But of course, I take my air quality monitors with me everywhere. I measure every building that I'm in. I was measuring them at the summit, and the air quality of that building did not get good over time. And I've been into net zero buildings. I've been into buildings that have all the environmental certifications, and the air quality is just like 2,800 parts per million on a vacant property with an ERV system running. So it's just very interesting once you start getting into properties and actually doing monitoring, and then trying to relay that data to the occupant. Um, is a challenge, and from these one takes there's a certain kind of methodology and a way that you need to really be able to explain that people, depending on where they are and how they think, that they actually do have the power to, well, number one, they can believe the data, right? um, there's truth in the data. The data, trust is the new gold. They used to say data is the new gold, but now I think it's trust is the new gold. And then they, feel empowered to be able to make some changes on their own. Like we send them low cost, no cost mitigation strategies. Open a window, turn on your hood fan, turn on your air purifier. We're seeing a lot of humidifiers that are not performing very well. We're seeing homes with particulate matters at 300, 350, 400, um, and staying that way, not spiking and coming down, like staying that way until they turn off their humidifier. Then it goes to zero. So talk a little bit about kind of what you found, both in personal experience and some of your research in regards to just how occupants, ingest some of this data and make changes in their lifestyles.
Yeah, and it's, probably one of the longest journeys we've yet to go on. We're only really just in this new world of being able to see the air that we're breathing for the first time. I'll talk about it a little bit in a minute, but
Hmm.
it's this I can't remember who coined the term or who said it to me the other day, but trust but verify
Yeah,
is my new kind of slogan, right?
Ronald
Is
Reagan.
this yeah, trust but verify. And I think there's a lot to that. The technical community, the consultants, the professionals have only just started to wrap their head around the idea that we can start to see the air that we're breathing in ways that we've not been able to before. And that's opening up all sorts of new avenues for providing better homes for people.
Mhm.
But we're still quite a long way away from consumers understanding that they can see the air that they're breathing and then placing that in a frame that enables them to have agency to be able to do something about it. And I think we're only just starting to begin that journey for many people in society. and again, I will talk about this a little bit. Air quality is only one of the daily battles they have to fight.
Right.
And we're not only competing in a very noisy information space in
Mm,
general, we're also competing in the real world where people have got real challenges. And we have to understand where, however important we think air quality is, where that fits within their daily grind, and find ways of meeting people where they are. Whether it's a sticker on a cooker hood that says hob on, fan on to remind people to turn the fan on when they're using the cooker, or whether it's a clever digital sensor, in their bedroom to help remind them to open the window a crack, or as has been popular over here in Europe, I don't know if it made it over to the States, this idea of luften, or they coined the term in the UK, house burping. We're trying to bring back this old idea of airing the home.
oh,
So
spring, like that we generally do that in the springtime. Get some fresh air, open the windows, open the door. Yeah. Yeah.
so it depends on your climate and region,
Burping.
obviously,
Okay.
where that happens. But generally speaking, if it's colder outside than it is inside, then
hmm
generally the moisture will be lower, even if it's
hmm
raining.
hmm
So this idea of throwing the home open and getting the air moving through the property doesn't really matter what the environment is outside. If you've got radon problems in your home, it's only going to help, right? And if you live in certain climates, it will help at certain times of year. But it's these kind of ideas that of meeting people where they are, because the the thing that moves the needle in homes often isn't technology, it's habit and culture. So we've and language, and we've got to find ways of communicating effectively with people, because ultimately, if people don't feel, and this is what really came through, I think, in these one takes in this early part of the year, is that people need to feel they've got agency in this. They need to feel that they're part of the solution. That you can't just tell somebody that they're vulnerable to air pollution. We have to provide them the tools to help them lift themselves out of that risk space.
No, that's been very helpful and just right on time because I'm admittedly just not I'm doing the best I can to be, as really elevate my senses and my compassion and empathy for residents that are going through this. But sometimes there's a communication challenge there that someone would think that radon at 8 or 10 picocuries, like, not that it's okay, but it's like I'm trying to, I'm sending screenshots like, okay, this is what it equates to in regards to the amount of cigarettes that you're smoking. But then, like you said, people have a lot of other things that they're dealing with, especially when you're dealing with, very busy executives as well.
And
So
radon
sometimes it's I don't know if I really want to see what's going on.
And radon is a particularly unique problem. We know this internationally. They've seen this in Canada, we've seen it in Ireland, we've seen it across Europe. There's something unique about radon where people really don't want to know.
hmm hmm
There's this trope in radon assessments that you can't give a test away. There was a big study done over in the west of Galway
hmm
in an area of very high radon, and listeners might know Ireland struggles with radon. It's basically built on a big lump of granite, and they couldn't give the tests away. They were offered free to residents of this particular area, and they couldn't give them away. And eventually, they managed to get a cohort of them to sign up and do the radon. And it was no surprise there were pretty high levels of radon in homes. But because so many hadn't actually been able to use the test, they had quite a lot of funds left over. So they offered remediation for free. And only 50% of the people that had high levels of radon took up the remediation.
At no cost
So
to them.
there's no cost to them. So there's something psychological going on there that people just don't want to know. They feel like it might impact the value of their home,
Mhm.
maybe that it's a risk that they may not want to know about. Um, it's an odd one, and it's something quite unique to radon, I think. But I think there's some lessons in there for everybody, that we can't just assume that because you highlight that there's a risk, people are necessarily going to pay attention, care,
Mhm.
or even take action.
Mhm.
You know?
Mhm. Wow. Yeah. I'm learning
Mm.
a lot. I said before we started, before I hit the record button, I'm kind of addicted to your podcast because it's teaching me all these things kind of as a practitioner, kind of in real time. But, I think one of the things you wanted to talk about today was, since you started your podcast 3 years ago, you've had like 2 million conversations or 2 million words or 2 million. I don't know quite how you define it, but you've had a lot of conversations with a lot of different people across the country. I think one of my favorite was probably your interview with or your conversation. My two favorites were with Dr. Joseph Allen and Rafer Wallace from Reset. But talk a little bit about kind of your journey through this and what you learned along the way.
Well, I mean, that how long have we got? I mean, I've been very fortunate, over the past couple of years that, through the podcast, that I've been able to sit down with some of the world's brightest minds effectively on air quality, including, you know, top tier communicators like Joseph Allen, who's not only very smart, clearly, but also very good at articulating this subject of air quality. To godfathers of air quality like Charles Weschler, who, if you look at any paper on ozone, which is a huge problem, you'll see Weschler et al. Written in there somewhere. It's quite phenomenal. All the way through to learning early career, PhD students, working at the frontier of microplastics in airborne particles and, you know, uh, personalized ventilation systems in India, so it's an incredibly privileged position to be in. And one of the beauties of modern technology is obviously that transcripts are created from each of the podcasts. And what became quite clear is just the volume of words of text that have been recorded. So over the 2 years, I say we've recorded over 2 million spoken words of conversation, and that is absolutely true. The each podcast episode will be somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 spoken words. So it's an enormous privilege to not only be bear witness to those conversations, to have them and to learn from them. It's like the best university in the world where I get to determine to some degree the topic of the
I feel the
conversation,
exact same way about Maryland
you know?
Climate Tech. This is our third year doing it. We've got close to 140 hours of recorded content by the time we launch on March 19th. But you've got new content launching every day. Every day I'm getting a message because I'm an automatic subscribe to your channel that a new podcast has dropped. So you're putting out a lot of content, man. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's easy in the sense that all I have to do is do some research, sit down and have a conversation with somebody I like talking to, about a subject I'm passionate about. So from my perspective, it's not hard miles. If you were to try and sit down and produce that content every week, it would be unbelievably difficult to do.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
really, it's the experts that bring that knowledge to bear. I'm just there to hopefully ask the questions that the listeners would ask if they were in my position, and that's really my job. And it was the reason we started the podcast in the first place. I'm in a very fortunate position in my role internationally that I get to have some of these conversations anyway. And it struck me that it was somehow unfair that I was the only one that was getting to sit down and have a 2 hour chat with a
Mhm,
Pavel Wargocki of this world or with a
mhm,
Joseph Allen of this world. And that the podcast medium was one of the few mediums out there that facilitates such a long conversation and an opportunity to really dive into subjects you wouldn't be afforded the luxury of having the time. There's almost no other format, where you can listen to somebody for 2 hours, on something. So yeah, very, very fortunate, really.
hugely beneficial for me, especially when I've got a 2 hour drive between appointments, stuck in traffic, to be able to just kind of digest the content. But one of the podcasts that I thought was very interesting as well that I recently listened to was about environmental certification plaques and your perspective on that and the newly launched Global Commission on Healthy Indoor Air, of which we've got a couple of commissioners that'll be speaking at Maryland Climate Tech, which we're very excited about. But can you kind of rewind and come again with that and talk a little bit about kind of your take on environmental certifications and this newly launched commission, and whether it's forming kind of an elite group of haves and have-nots.
Yeah, I think something that I was reflecting on, and it was since the launch of it at the UN pledge, the UN General Assembly pledge last September, and it's something that has troubled me since then, and that was this idea of air quality being a human right,
Mhm.
which I'll talk about in a minute. It's very important and a very worthwhile position to take, and I think when you say something is a right, it becomes a matter of fairness. And what it empowers people to do is say that it's not fair that I suffer from poor air quality, or that I live in a city with poor air quality, or that I'm a tenant in a home with damp and mold. Um, so it's a really important position to take. But with that comes an awful lot of responsibility. When we talk about a global pledge for air quality as a human right, that the rights of people in one country can be very different, as you know, to the rights of somebody in another country, or even from city to city within the United States. So with that comes a lot of responsibility. And it was that really I was musing on, about this idea of when you have organizations like the International World Building Institute that have done so much for showing the value of air quality and turning it into a premium that encourages real estate effectively to invest in healthy buildings. Does that sit in some way in juxtaposition with something as a human right? If the thing that moves the needle is assets and real estate and money, is the right attention going to be put on the areas where we're talking about the have-nots, with the people that don't have the money, where if the needle is going to be moved in public housing and underinvested schools, are we going to see the same attention there as we do to a Deloitte's headquarters building in New York City, for example? So it was an interesting musing really about this idea of we have to be careful on two, and again I'll talk about this very briefly. On two sides of the proverbial street in a city, you will have the haves and have-nots. That's just the nature of society. And if we're talking about air quality as a right, we have to figure out how to manage that, because sustainability has had that battle and has failed, arguably, to argue that case that sustainability has become a shishi foo-foo, champagne venture for the haves, and has left the third world behind largely, and often the thing that lifts people and makes decarbonizes a sector is lifting an entire economy out of poverty. And often to do that, you need to have things like fossil fuels, for example, to do that. So there are really uncomfortable conversations that have to happen at a global level often when we're talking about these big ideas. And it was that I was kind of musing over and saying, what does that look like?
Yeah, yeah, definitely encourage folks to check that out. It was definitely an interesting perspective. You mentioned, I think on one of your takes, climate change and record high humidity is expected to make moisture damage in buildings worse. And it got me to thinking, how much moisture is is in 100-year-old brick front home here in Baltimore. Baltimore has more historic architecture than New York and DC combined. We've got more historic architecture than any other place in the country, and most of them are brick front homes, 100, 150, 175-year-old homes. And then on top of that is some of the homes have form stone on top of that, which creates moisture. And so I did some AI research and found out that close to what a cup of water can be in a brick, in each brick on a brick home. So it's just, last year here in the States we had record high humidity as well. Um, can you kind of expand on that, and how, the exterior of the building, especially on some of the older properties, some of them the air quality is a little bit better because it breathes a little bit better. And it's not one of the newer kind of weatherized buildings, but sometimes weatherization as a solution can encapsulate some of these mold spores and make the building actually a little bit worse if it's not being validated with air quality monitors.
Yeah, well, you're touching on a very big subject that is, incredibly deep rooted in a lot of the building science and building physics in Europe, because, something like 90% of the buildings that are going to be around for the 2050, 2060
Mhm.
carbon targets already exist in Europe. Um, so we have a huge problem with what to do with our existing buildings. One of the challenges with older buildings is they arrived at their design through iteration, often over centuries. Yeah, and they're very localized for localized weather conditions, for the building materials that are available locally. They're not there by accident. And when they didn't work, they changed by iteration over time. So buildings typically worked through that iteration. And what's happened in the last half a century is we've fundamentally changed how we use those spaces. We've introduced a lot more moisture in buildings. We heat them in a lot, very different ways. We're removing fireplaces, electrifying them. All sorts of things are going on that those buildings were never meant to deal with. And on top of that, then we're introducing elements to the fabric itself that can have an impact on how moisture moves in and out and through those buildings.
Mhm.
So it's hugely complex, and you're getting into the world of things like what we call interstitial condensation, which is this idea of where a dew point might exist within a wall structure.
Mhm.
And properly designed with the proper modeling, that's perfectly easy to manage. But when we don't think about it and do things like put concrete on the outside of a breathable wall or put a membrane on the inside without thinking about the impact of it, all of these things can have unintended consequences. And it's one of the lessons that perhaps Europe, and particularly I know the UK, have been going through for a very long time and have learned a lot of very hard lessons along the way about not thinking through what we do to buildings carefully. So managing and changing buildings is just one very big risk game that you have to be careful of and think about the systemic thinking, think about the unintended consequences of what you're doing. And one really important pillar of that is making sure we manage the environment with adequate ventilation. And unfortunately, we don't get that right enough. I call this a
So,
story about a girl and her mirror, and you'll see why. I mean, basically, I'm a parent of teenage daughters,
mhm.
which is really just a polite way of saying I'm a man who spends most of his time completely and utterly baffled by the inhabitants of my own home. Um, if you have a teenager, you know the terrain, right? That their bedrooms aren't so much living spaces as kind of high stakes archaeological digs. It's a kind of a battlefield of discarded hoodies, knickers, and makeup palettes scattered across the floor. And then there's the mirror. It kind of possesses for them this kind of magnetic gravitational pull so strong it could bend light practically. If with my daughter's mirror, it wasn't bending under the weight of the lights that were on it. It looks more like a floodlight than a ring light around this mirror. Um, and my kind of weird primary role in this ecosystem is to stand in the doorway and kind of just point out the bomb site that is a makeup table and try and deliver a top tier dad joke, right? And that's usually met with kind of standard issue teenage eye rolls and that kind of universal signal that they have that I need to stop talking forever. And with almost zero intention of actually doing anything about clearing the mess up. Um, it's easy to look at that world and see only kind of self-absorption, right, with teenage girls. But if you kind of look closer, you actually see it's a world of profound vulnerability. It's a space brimming with self-doubt and the weight of peer pressure and the quiet kind of anxieties of a young person just trying to find her place in the world. And as a parent, I watch this kind of ordered chaos, and my instinct is to protect them. Have a moan about the mess, yes, but you want to build a fortress around your kids and you want to give them every possible advantage to ensure they don't just survive in the world, but they flourish in it. I'm kind of looking over my dog there, and I'm thinking actually dogs would be a lot easier to bring up. Um, but then I step out of my front door, and my professional life, as we've been talking about, pulls me in a completely different reality. As a consultant, I'm often the person that's called in when the physical fabric of a building begins to fail. On the surface, my job is technical, right? I'm there to diagnose the building physics, the moisture risk, or the botched ventilation system, or the pervasive kind of creeping damp. But what I'm really there to do is investigate the systems that allow those failures to happen in the first place. I spend my time generally looking at the invisible structures, the broken supply chains, the race to the bottom procurement, the strategic apathy that constantly fails the people that have the least to give them the power to fight back. It's a recurring pattern where the biological ceiling or potential of a family is often set by a policy document or lack of one in an office miles away. I wanted to tell a story about a recent experience I had because I think it's quite powerful. Recently, I was inspecting an estate that told a very typical story, right, of systemic neglect. It was written on the peeling paint, in the cold drafts, through ill-fitting windows, and that kind of faint, heavy scent of mildew that greets you in the hallways, like an unwanted guest. And I was there to do what I normally do, right? Which was go through my checklists to do the technical bit. And then, as happens from time to time, um, I stepped into someone's world that stopped me in my tracks, not because of a data point, but this time because of a mirror. Um, you see a gaggle of us, the local housing officer, the regional manager, and I were walking around the state doing what we do. And we knocked on a door of a pretty unremarkable house. When it opened, a figure scurried past me in the narrow hallway, and she was a teenager, exactly the same age as my daughters, dressed in her pajamas with an oversized hoodie on. She kind of cast her eyes down and gave a quick, embarrassed apology, as teenagers do, and said, "Dad, they're here," before scurrying off. And she kind of vanished into a back room, and I never saw her again. That was the only real image I had of this girl. Um, but the house itself was pretty grim. The air in that house was thick. It was thick with the smell of damp, of stale cigarettes, of stale beer, and something else, a palpable sense of defeat. If you walk these environments enough, particularly in public housing, you'll know what I mean. Uh, we walked around the property taking notes of the technical failures, which there were many, and eventually stepped into this girl's bedroom. It was stark, right? Almost empty. There was an old worn out bunk bed designed for much younger children, and it dominated the small space with not much else around. And nothing was on the top bunk. I remember it really clearly to this day. And on the bottom was a mix of duvets and old sleeping bags piled up in a way that shouted, "This space is damp and cold."
Mm.
And there was a single light bulb that kind of dimly lit the space, really kind of bleak perspective. And on the bare wooden floor, amidst the grime and the dust and the creeping black mold on the skirting board, lay a scattered array of makeup. And it was uncannily similar to my daughter's. And next to it, leaning against that damp wall, was a large shard of broken mirror.
Mm.
This this environment is, yes, one of a social making. It's a story of neglect, clearly, that it had shadows of parental addiction, of the crushing weight of mental health problems in that home. And yes, also it was a technical one. It was a house that was underheated as a result of fuel poverty. It was poorly insulated. It was plagued by poor ventilation and air quality that led to the damp and mold that we were seeing. And I've seen hundreds like this, as I'm sure you have. Uh, but as I stood there in that particular dim, cold room, looking at that broken mirror, the parallels to my own kids were impossible to shake. Something far more insidious was there happening in front of me. I was staring at a lost childhood, at a future being robbed in real time. The life she was living in that room was not only robbing her of her present, keeping her from school, draining her energy, attacking her immune system, but it was actively creating a glass ceiling for her future. A, a childhood that should have mirrored my own daughter's, one of sleepovers and visitors and teenage discos, of homework, of God help me, boyfriends, was instead a childhood of worry and anxiety and of the crushing responsibility that came with an environment not of her own making. And I think about that girl often. I see her reflection in my own daughter's life journey, and it haunts me. I'll be honest with you. It it's a reminder to me that the time thief of poor environments, whether that's damp and mold or exposure to pollution or even radon, as we were talking about, that robs people of their future in real time, does not visit everybody equally. And I can sit here today and I can give you a talk on the physics of moisture risk, but I won't, because I know that whatever technical facts I share, the only thing that will truly be remembered is the story of that girl and her broken mirror and what her life should have been. And that's exactly where we need to start, because her story is the ultimate symptom of a contract we have broken and that we desperately need to fix. We made a fundamental evolutionary deal with our environment. We started building structures to keep the rain off, to keep the predators out, to provide a safe and stable platform for our species to flourish. Our buildings had one job: to protect us. It is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? But over the last half a century, particularly, I think we've lost sight of that deal. We've become obsessed with the box. We've become fixated on how airtight we could make it, how energy efficient it could be, how cheap we could stack the materials, or how little we could spend in maintaining it. And in our rush to seal our boxes from the heat or cold, where depending on where you live, to save a few pounds on a heating bill or to meet a theoretical carbon target on a spreadsheet, I think we've completely forgotten the mammal inside. And in doing so, we've allowed a villain into our homes that follows us to our schools and to our offices. And this is not a corporate bogeyman in a pinstripe suit. It's invisible, silent, and infinitely more dangerous. It's poor indoor air quality. And I've been coining it recently the time thief. When we allow our buildings to be underventilated, when we normalize black mold creeping up a child's bedroom wall, or when we're effectively allowing a thief into our home to rob us of the only truly non-renewable source we have, which is our time. And what we have to remember is for every girl in a horrendous environment like the one I was describing, or the tragic death of a 2-year-old boy like our Bishak in public housing in the UK, thousands are just getting by, not serious enough to make the news, require a visit from an expert like me, or even a phone call to a landlord. But nonetheless, the time thief creeps through their home too, exacerbating asthma, spreading illness, impacting sleep, and bit by bit, robbing us of the health and well-being that we deserve. So, a little thought experiment for you. And if you've heard the podcast, you might have heard this one before. Imagine your building had a state-of-the-art filter on the roof. It captures every heavy metal, every virus, every off-gassing chemical before it can settle. But instead of disposing of that toxic sludge, the system pipes it directly to your kitchen tap. Every glass of water you drink, every bath you give your kids is filled with that concentrated poison. Every second of every day in every building you occupy, your home, your school, your work, that's just the way buildings work. And there's nothing you can do about it. We'd be outraged, right? You demand that we sorted the air quality out to stop that happening. Yet what we don't realize is this exact scenario is happening right now. It's just happening invisibly through our lungs. As a society, we've become obsessed with what we consume. We scan labels for sugar. We obsess over calories or buy water filters because we don't trust the pipes. Yet we completely ignore our inhalable diet. Every day we consume 10,000 to 15,000 litres of air. And unlike food or water, you have no luxury of choice. You cannot simply stop breathing until conditions improve. Well, you can try, but it never works out very well for you. You tend to get an ambulance called on you at some point. We mistakenly think, I think, that our lungs are filters, biological screens that somehow were meant to keep the bad stuff out. And that's a fatal misunderstanding if you think about it. Our lungs are not a barrier at all. They are, in fact, an open door with the surface area the size of a badminton court. They're a high-speed delivery mechanism directly into your bloodstream. So every breath that we take, every minute of the day, in every space that we occupy, we're breathing and capturing pollutants. These particles we breathe are often just microscopic bits of soot or carbon, but they act as a Trojan horse. As they travel through a poorly ventilated home, they settle and resuspend. They absorb a toxic cocktail of volatile organic compounds, heavy metals, carcinogens, you name it. And once we inhale these microscopic rafts, they ferry past our natural defenses to every organ of our body, our hearts, our livers, our lungs, our brain. And this triggers systemic inflammation and accelerates biological decay. This is where the time thief extracts its toll. In public health terms, if you don't know it, we often talk about DALYs, disability adjusted life years. It's a kind of a cold calculation for of healthy time lost to disease or early death. This thief starts early. Injury passed from mother to child before birth. It loiters over a newborn's cot in a home. By 11 a.m. in an underventilated classroom, children's brains are marinating a fog of their own breath, stealing their learning potential. It is the millions of school days lost to asthma that can never ever be recovered, to unnecessary illness acquired that need not have been because of winter flu season. This thief follows us into our adulthood, disguised as the post-lunch slump or brain fog or simple tiredness. In reality, it's a biological tax we pay for the air we inhabit. Over decades, it nibbles at our health, turning our most vibrant years into an exhausting struggle against our own environment. The time thief is robbing us blind. And its greatest trick was convincing us that that's just the way things are. The trouble is, here's the unvarnished truth of the matter. That time is stolen, and it's stolen unequally. If you walk down the proverbial city street, and we were just talking about this a minute ago, on one side of the street, you have a platinum certified ESG compliant corporate headquarters. Inside, every breath is filtered through hospital grade HVAC systems. The air is monitored by AI, balanced for humidity and CO2, explicitly designed to ensure the maximum cognitive performance and health of the high value mammals inside, right? And good luck to them. But on the other side of the exact same proverbial street, you can have a social housing block or a public housing area. Inside, a single mother is drying her children's clothes on radiators she can't afford to heat because of fuel costs. The cheap vents in the window are broken, or she's had to tape them shut because of the draft freezing her kids. And she's breathing, and her kids are breathing, a pea soup of invisible particulate matter from the busy road outside, nitrogen dioxide from the cheap gas hob, and the spores of black mold that are slowly, inevitably colonizing the corner of her child's bedroom, not to mention potentially radon. This is not just the failure of building physics, it is the defining environmental and social justice failure of our time. For the most vulnerable people in our society, the risk of the built environment are not just added together, they are multiplied. And this is what we call triple jeopardy. First, there is the increased exposure. So the poorest members of our society are systematically funneled into the most polluted environments, both indoors and outdoors. They live the closest to the main roads, in the most poorly maintained housing stock with the worst ventilation. Second, there is increased susceptibility. So nearly 50% of the population lives with some form of chronic health condition that air quality exacerbates. And these conditions cluster heavily in lower socioeconomic groups. So the people living in the absolute worst buildings are biologically the least able to tolerate them. And third, there is decreased capabilities, and this effectively means they lack the power to change it. A wealthy person faced with bad air can buy a £500 HEPA filter if they want to. They can hire a contractor to fix the ventilation or simply move house. But a family in social or public housing cannot. They're trapped. And what does construction or the housing industry or landlords do when these buildings inevitably fail? How do we respond when the walls turn black and children start coughing? We default to a defense mechanism that's as cowardly as it is common, unfortunately, and that's tenant blaming. When a mother complains that her chest feels tight and her baby is constantly sick, the system treats her lived experience as anecdote. A surveyor will turn up, look at the mold, and tell her she's cooking too much, she's showering too much, she's breathing too much. It's the ultimate institutional form of systemic gaslighting. We design and build a cheap, airtight box that fundamentally cannot handle a human being living a normal biological life. And then we blame the human for living in it. We blame the victim for the failure of the architecture. We dismiss them, we gaslight them, and we ignore them until tragedy occurs. We ignore them until a 2-year-old child like our Bishak dies from prolonged, unavoidable exposure to mold, while his family, desperate pleas for help, are brushed off as lifestyle choices. The collective amnesia must end, and the not my job mate culture of the building supply chain has to be dismantled. We need to see an end to the fact that every time that this is looked at, 3/4 of the homes don't even meet minimum code. Minimum codes or minimum standards in reality are just the worst possible ventilation allowed by law, bear in mind. But there is good news. The era of getting away with this is fast coming to an end, and we are standing, I think, at the dawn of change. For decades, the air was invisible, which meant the crime was invisible. But the evolution of low-cost sensors, as you were pointing out, Aaron, environmental sensors have fundamentally changed the landscape of power. We are finally giving the vulnerable a receipt for their building's failure. When a resident can pull out a smartphone and show a housing officer a graph proving that the relative humidity in their bedroom has been hovering over 70% for 6 months, and that the CO2 levels are peaking off of 9,000 parts per million every night, the gaslighting stops. Suddenly, that mother is no longer an anecdote. She's no longer a complainer, and she is a witness armed with empirical, undeniable evidence. Data is the flashlight that exposes the time thief. The housing providers, it builds feedback loops of evidence that we have been missing. It allows us to iterate, to assess and improve the products we sell in ways other industries have been doing for decades. But data is just the diagnosis. We need the cure. And the cure is not a new type of fan or a different brand of insulation. The cure is a fundamental philosophical shift in how we value human life inside the built environment. We must move away from a world where we judge the success of a building by the theoretical thickness of its insulation or the hypothetical energy rating on a piece of paper or indeed its value. We need to move to a world where a building is judged legally, financially, and morally by the health of the people who occupy it. We need to establish a permanent culture of care. Think about fire safety, right? We don't treat fire safety as a productivity hack. We don't install fire doors only in the offices of a CEO. We recognize fire safety as a fundamental, non negotiable requirement for a civilized society. If a building is a fire risk, it is illegal to occupy it. It's that simple. And when the system fails, as it did catastrophically in London at Grenfell, no one is immune from the dock. It's time we applied that exact same moral absolute to the 15,000 litres of air that we draw into our bodies every single day. If a building traps toxic pollutants, if it fosters mold, if it creates a biological glass ceiling for a child living inside it, it is a failed building, full stop. As I finish, I just want to take you back to that damp house. I want to take you back to that shy teenage girl in her pajamas and the broken mirror sitting on her floor. She shouldn't have to fight a broken, apathetic system just for the right to take a clean breath of fresh air. She and millions like her deserve the evolutionary deal we promised of our built environment. They deserve a safe, secure platform to flourish. They deserve an environment that lifts them up, not one that systematically breaks down their biology. Clean indoor air is not a luxury amenity for the wealthy. It is not a corporate premium. It is a basic, inclusive, non-negotiable human right. If that young girl is lucky enough to live to 80 years of age, she will spend 70 years of her life indoors, 55 years in her own home. The majority of our exposure to even outdoor air pollution will occur indoors. So our buildings, our homes, have an enormous impact on our long-term health and well-being. We do not build boxes to house people. We build environments to support human life. And I think it's time we took the blindfold off. And I think it's time we look in the mirror. And it's time we lock the door on the time thief once and for all. Thanks.
Wow, that was amazing. Um, Thank you for that. I feel like I had my own custom one take. That was that was
You're
good.
welcome.
Hey,
Welcome to my ramblings.
yeah, no, this was great. In the minute or so that we have left, I've often heard the saying that our DNA is the bullet in the chamber, and indoor air quality is the premature trigger. And that sounds very, very much close to what you were saying. Just when you're talking about the time thief, I'm thinking of like the Grim Reaper coming and stealing time away from those who need it the most. So I appreciate you, Simon. And this has been a great joy. I appreciate it.
You're absolutely welcome. And I hope some people got some value in some way out of that story. Thanks a million.
I'm
Appreciate it.
sure they will. I'm sure they will. Until we talk again, my friend, I'm sure I'll probably see you somewhere again in the States or talk to you sooner. Have a great day, my friend.
No problem at all. Thanks a million.
All right, have a good one. Bye bye.